Okay, hello. Thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Becca and I am the Director of Education at Breaking the Silence, and I will be facilitating this conversation. Before I introduce our panelists today, maybe I'll just give a brief introduction to what we're talking about. So earlier this month, Elizabeth Daskin of the Washington Post published a pretty incredible, stunning expose on the use of a new technology called Blue Wolf. And Blue Wolf is a mass surveillance system that's being operated by soldiers in the West Bank in occupied territory. And the process involves photographing and collecting sensitive information on local Palestinians, on the civilian population, such as people's names, who they are, personal information. And the story was brought to light thanks to a group of brave soldiers who each individually came to Breaking the Silence in order to share that they had used or been exposed to this new technology, Blue Wolf, and felt that the use of this technology on the civilian population was not a moral thing, is not something that we should keep silent about. And that it really raises in general some serious questions as to the role of technology within the context of the occupation. And that's what we're going to dig in today on our panel. So today we have with us Ori Givati, who is the advocacy director of Breaking the Silence and who helped break the story of the use of Blue Wolf. We have with us also Issa Amro, who is a human rights defender and resident of the city of Hebron, who will talk about the effects on the city, both as human rights defenders and as civilians. And we have with us Gil Moore, who is the Civil and Social Rights Director at the Association for Civil Rights in Israel. And Gil actually heads the Human Rights in the Digital Age project. So it's of course very, very relevant to the topic that we are covering today, which is technology and occupation. And as I mentioned before, I'm Becca Strober, the Director of Education at Breaking the Silence. And maybe I'll just start before handing it over to Ori by saying that, something we know from our testimonies at Breaking the Silence and that, soldiers who served in occupied territories are aware of is that techniques that we use in the West Bank to kind of control en masse the civilian population is not new. In fact, for the 20 years that we've been collecting testimonies, so one of the most common commands that we get in the West Bank as soldiers is actually to do something called making our presence felt, which means making sure the civilian population feels our presence. And sometimes even being said is that Palestinians feel as though we're breathing down their neck. And why? So that they'll be too afraid to attack us, right? So that they'll be too afraid to attack soldiers or to attack civilians. And in that sense, in the Israeli army, the army basically looks at all Palestinians in the West Bank, all 2.5 million people in the West Bank, as potential threats. And I think the use of this new technology really fits into that kind of general perspective that we have in the army and that we as soldiers were taught. And I'd like to actually open with a testimony about this new technology, I think to give an idea from, first person, a soldier who used it, what we're talking about. And so I'm going to start with this testimony by a first sergeant who gave testimony about his experience in 2020, so just last year, while serving in the city of Hebron. And he says, there's a new program called the Blue Wolf. Blue Wolf is this phone, like one of those old Samsungs, where you take a photo of the person's face, his ID. What's this phone? It's just a phone that only has a program on it. It just has a camera and this program. And the interviewer asked, describe how this system is used. And he says, we go around, it can be used in all kinds of neighborhoods in Hebron. And suddenly you can be at a post. Sometimes we saw it. Suddenly someone arrives and he's like, give me your ID. Like, we're going to take a photo of you. The soldier's talking about taking a photo of a Palestinian. And then it's kept. And then if he arrives at the police or something, and then it just pops up immediately, his photo. And then also when you do the Blue Wolf, you can also get an option to detain, arrest, release, or to check him. I think there was once an issue of mapping where you could enter a house and literally write everything down. I honestly think this replaced mapping missions. Instead of writing down here lives X, Y, Z, you simply have photos and an ID. The interviewer asks him, did they talk to you about the aim of this thing, meaning the aim of this new technology? And the soldier says, kind of vague answers. You're the authority there. You need to be in control. And in the end, it prevents terror attacks. The rationale is at the end of the day that it shows you all kinds of notifications about him, about the Palestinian you're looking up, and all kinds of things. And then if you can see someone who's suspected of something, like if you take a photo of him, you get a pop-up to arrest him. And then when you take his picture, it lights in all sorts of colors. Yellow means to detain, red is to arrest. That happened to us once. Like we kind of arrested him, but that too, what does that mean? We released him after a few hours. We took him to the base and released him. And the interviewer asks, and how do you decide who to photograph? And the soldier says, whoever I feel like, whoever you want can stop and ask for ID. You're standing there, like 4 or 5 people with weapons in front of him. Some of them, they kind of say, I'm not willing to be photographed. I'm not willing to be photographed. But if there's an assertive squad commander, then he photographs him anyway. If there's a squad commander who's less assertive, he might give in. But in general, most don't resist it. And this new technology that we're seeing in the West Bank is really, an add-on of a lot of the policies that we've been seeing. And yet, when these testimonies and testifiers came to us at Breaking the Silence, there certainly was something that we realized, this is new. This is technology that we don't know. This is technology that we haven't used before. And we're going to start the panel today with Ori Givati of Breaking the Silence as well. And Ori, I actually want to start with asking, when you looked at these testimonies, what popped out to you as perhaps different or worrisome in terms of what we know to be the daily occupation and kind of daily control of lives of Palestinians in the West Bank?
Thank you, and hello everybody. Thank you for joining us. Look, I've been part of Breaking the Silence in the last 4.5 years. I started also as an interviewer. I interviewed myself over 120 soldiers. And of course, the occupation includes so many different elements that we already are sadly used to hear about. Yeah, home invasions, checkpoints, patrols, so forth. And I think that the unique part about those testimonies that we started hearing about in the last, let's say, 1.5 years, is that they show us another level. It's like another step. And one of the best ways to understand it, for me, was from reading the transcripts of the interviews. Some of them are published, some of them are not published yet. And understanding and reading from the transcript, I felt like I can understand how shocked, how surprised, and how maybe even a little bit angry our testifiers were when they talked about this new mission, right? When a soldier describes to us how they were sent to compete, and maybe we'll talk about it later, were sent to compete on who takes more photos of Palestinians during those missions. So I think this was new. This was new, the feeling that there is something more here, okay? Now, I'm saying this with a grain of salt, right? Because we have to remember, of course, that it's not like we don't want to create a competition, right, between taking photos of people in the street or invading their homes. But on the other hand, because we got used to so many elements, reading this for me as someone who is, very involved, very experienced in hearing soldiers' testimonies, for me, it was very clear that we're looking on something new, right? We're not anymore only invading their homes, putting the checkpoints, invading the villages, and so forth. We're now also sending soldiers to take pictures of people in the street, right? And I think one of the things that struck me the most was this arbitrariness that we are used to hear about about the rest of the missions, but it's so striking to hear that the mission is to take pictures of any person that walks by you in the street. It can be a kid, it can be an elderly, it can be any other person, and that you basically use those photos, those pictures, to win a competition against other units in the West Bank, right? So we're not even looking at it as it's important to take so many this and these photos for, I don't know, let's say protecting Tel Aviv. No, we want to win against another unit in the West Bank. That's the reason that we want to take so many photos. So I think these elements were very evident reading the transcripts.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it's interesting that, sometimes we have testifiers who come and don't necessarily know in the moment that they're doing something that it's wrong, but you can clearly feel from the testimonies about this technology that it felt wrong at the moment, right? It felt wrong at the present time. And I'm wondering, how do you kind of connect this to something we've been hearing about, and I'm sure also as you were collecting testimonies, this concept of not just preventing terror, but this kind of newer concept that the Army's been talking about this past few years of kind of widened prevention, right? In Hebrew, sikul mochav. How do you kind of connect this new technology into that general theme, and maybe also give people listening here a little bit of a kind of description and definition of this concept of expanded prevention?
So maybe I think the best way to start this answer is taking us 5 years back. The last time I served myself in the occupied territories as a reserve duty soldier, I served in the area of Kalkilia, and the first thing that we were told, my unit, by our commander, was that our mission is to make all of the Palestinians in the area of Kalkilia feel like they cannot lift their head up. This was the mission that we received. And when this is the mission we receive, basically every Palestinian becomes a legitimate target, right? Because we are not talking about every dangerous Palestinian who is, wanted by the Shabak. We're talking about every single Palestinian in our area needs to feel that they cannot lift their head up. And I think actually this in one sentence explains us this concept of extended prevention, right, that you mentioned. Because the only way to make all of the Palestinians in our area feel like they cannot lift their head up is to operate like all of them are our targets and to direct our missions towards all of these people. So when I was there it was 6 years ago, almost 6 years ago, we did it with checkpoints and invasions to villages and so forth. And with the years, we also improve and develop the way we create this prevention, right? So the Blue Wolf and the other systems, the Hebron Smart City and the checkpoint spatial recognition and so forth, also we also use them in order to control the Palestinian population, right? Because a Palestinian that walks in the streets of Hebron is already used to the fact that his home can be invaded in the middle of the night. He's used to the fact that on his way to work, he might be stopped at a checkpoint. He's used to the fact that if he goes to a protest completely non-violent protest, he might get shot. And now they're also used to the fact that when they walk in the street, their photos and biometric information might be taken by armed soldiers. We see this as, right, if you go now, take this whole conversation and bring it to the IDF spokesperson, okay? They will tell you something very simple. This is security. This is security. This is the only way we can create security for the in this situation. But what we have to remember is that today we allow ourselves to do everything in the name of this security, right? How can a competition of photographs of Palestinians in the street, including children and elderly, can be competition? And this is an outcome of a almost 55-year-old occupation that allows us to do more and more.
Thank you, Ori. I think something just kind of actually that I thought about when you were speaking is that we always talk about that we're trying to instill in Palestinians this concept of making our presence felt. But I think there's actually something that at least has potential, even if it hasn't quite gotten there technologically yet, but has the potential with technology like this, and not just making our presence felt, but making our presence actively there, right? Meaning it's no longer just we're a small group of soldiers trying to control a large population, so they should feel that we're present, but actually we can see people's movements in a much more regular basis. And that brings me actually, Issa, I want to turn the question to you. In the Washington Post article, Dauskin interviewed also a resident in Hebron. And one of the things that he shared was that, his daughter dropped a spoon from the roof of their house, and it kind of accidentally fell onto what seemed like a deserted road. But that within a few minutes, a group of soldiers appeared and basically threatened to write him up for stone throwing. One of the kind of new technologies that has been discussed in our testimonies at Breaking the Silence by our testifiers, in addition to the Blue Wolf, is this concept called Hebron Smart City, right? Which basically is this idea, and we saw the army starting to write about it slightly a little bit more than a year ago in October 2020, where the army basically says, they're putting up cameras throughout the city, and certainly as people, as guides of tours in Hebron, we spend a lot of time in the city. I remember thinking all of a sudden that, there's more cameras and more and more and more. And before I knew it, I remember walking into the city and thinking the whole entire city at this point is filled with cameras. And I wonder about that resident and how common his experience is. And so Issa, to start us off, what I'm wondering from you is, what has the experience been for residents of Hebron, especially residents who live close to the Israeli settlements in the past year? Have you seen a change in tactic or in frequency or in, intensity in which the army seems to be using technology? And also, where do you see it? I know there's also, use of technology also in checkpoints, right? And how does this, kind of affect the average person who's living in Hebron?
Okay, thank you very much. And I'm very happy to join today to talk about the situation under this new technology. I want just to remind everybody that Hebron is H2 in Hebron is very restricted since the Ibrahimi Mosque massacre in 1994. We have 22 checkpoints, more than 100 movement barriers. We have 1,800 shops closed by the Israeli closure policy. We have around 1,000 Palestinian apartments became empty. So the area where I usually do my activities and where Palestinians are suffering is very, very restricted. And maybe you will see a soldier every 2 to 3 meters. And for the Palestinians, we don't say Hebron is a smart city. We see that Hebron is a racist city. Hebron is an apartheid city that we as Palestinians, we suffer from time to time from the Israeli military, and this kind of cameras and applications and surveillance, intelligence, it's a tool for in the hand of the Israeli occupation and in the hand of the Israeli settlers to make it impossible for the Palestinians to remain in their homes. So they live by their own. So they don't evict you directly, but they make it impossible for you to stay or remain. So it's about taking the Palestinians away, and in a way or another, they are winning. We have around 43% of the housing units in Hebron are empty because of this kind of techniques and tactics. So the occupation is trying to be creative in making the life of the Palestinians harder and harder. And about how to feed this kind of systems, me personally, I was detained many times at the checkpoints because I refused to accept soldiers taking my photos with my ID. I was detained in all over West Bank with cars, and people were waiting for hours because soldiers wanted to take the photo of the driver with his driving license. You know, so Palestinians suffered a lot because of this kind of technology. Usually technology in the world is there to make the life of people easier. But under the occupation, this kind of technology is making our life harder and harder. And it's not about that it's cameras in London or cameras in New York. No, it's not the same. We are under the occupation, and the occupation is using these tools to make our life harder and harder. And the best example, they don't use this against the settlers who are living in West Bank, and they are very violent, and they are well known of their violence, and they are well known of their fanatic attitude. And we know that the settler violence increased maybe 2 times more in the last 1 year, at least in West Bank, and especially in Hebron. So to live in Hebron with this, that everything is under the Israeli army and the Israeli settlers' control. By the way, we have 2 camera systems, one for the Israeli army and one for the Israeli settlers. And as a human rights defender, I feel that I don't have a privacy. On the time that all the people in the world are talking about how Facebook or Twitter or other companies, they should respect the privacy of their clients. We in the West Bank, and especially in Hebron, we don't have any privacy. In the house, you are filmed. In the street, you are filmed. In your way to school, you are filmed, photographed. Soldiers, whenever they want, they come in the street, take your details. And the main issue that as a Palestinian, your information and your details are in a hand of an 18 years old soldier who act according to his ideology. And we suffer a lot from that and a teenagers, soldier know more about us. And me as a human rights defender who is labeled to be checked, detained all the time at checkpoints, wherever I go in West Bank, I suffer a lot. And I'm afraid about my life even because of this kind of technology. So for the Palestinians, it's really making their life harder and harder to go even further. And something else very important, Pika, it's a kind of using the Palestinians as a simulation object. It's a kind of we are an experiment for this kind of new technology for the Israeli army without our will. They didn't ask us if we want to be part of this technology project or that kind of technology project. So they are trying to test this new technology on the Palestinians, especially in Hebron. Then they sell it to Kashmir, they sell it to India, they sell it I don't know where. So we are a training object when they train the army, and we are a training object when they try to use a new technology against Palestinian civilians. So the Palestinians are very angry, very disappointed, and they feel more segregated and more separated, and they feel that their privacy, their personal privacy, is violated. And I can tell you that many Palestinians in Hebron, when we talked about this new technology, they raised huge concern. And they say, okay, do I need to close my curtains all the time in the house so the cameras in the area don't see me? Because it's every few meters you see one camera or two cameras or three cameras. So the people don't feel, you know, any kind of privacy, even inside their homes in Hebron.
Are you seeing, Issa, you know, one of the things that has always struck me in the past, I don't know, year or two or couple of years really is also the how technologically advanced you see that checkpoints have become. And, you know, where you live in Tel Rumeida, anyway, for those who don't know, for those who are joining for the first time and haven't been with us to Hebron yet, in Tel Rumeida, people who aren't residents aren't allowed to enter that neighborhood. Palestinians who aren't residents aren't allowed to enter that neighborhood. And I'm wondering, Issa, if you're seeing kind of an uptick with this technology, you know, in effects in neighborhoods like Tel Rumeida, in people's ability to move around, in people's ability to live their kind of daily lives in Hebron, which I know is anyway incredibly difficult, but, you know, are you seeing this as a tool? You said, you know, it's being used against everyone. It's an experiment. And is it having a negative effect on the kind of the daily lives of people? Because the army is saying, well, this technology improves the lives of Palestinians because now, you know, it will be easier to stop people who are charged with a crime or who are, you know, we believe might be a threat to Israelis or to our troops, right? But what's the experience from your side?
You know, first, it's a big lie that they are using this technology for security. If it's for security, why they don't use it for against the settlers as well, who are very famous in Hebron that they are fanatic and extreme. So why they use it only against me and other Palestinians? And I am well-known human rights defender. I believe only in non-violence, and my group Youth Against Settlement only believe in non-violence resistance as the only way to end the Israeli occupation and apartheid. So they are even picking, you know, whom to target. I know that they can't use it against the settlers, but they can use it against the Palestinians. And women many times refused to pass a checkpoint because they didn't want their photos to be taken by the Israeli soldiers, but it was taken even against their will. So this kind of technology, for sure, is not making our life easier. In the country, the occupation is there to make our life harder and to prove that 43% of the housing units became empty. If it's easy for people to come in and out, and this technology is really smart, you know, people will come back to their homes. But now people are leaving their homes, and this is what the occupation is doing. Is working to make our life harder and harder. And nobody asked us for this new technology if we like it or not, or we want to use it or not. The army didn't ask us. It's against our will, and it's an Israeli military occupation. It's not our country. It's not our land, you know, our area. It's not our government who we vote for. We can't say anything against that. We don't know about what they do with our data. I was complaining to Facebook for using my data. I was complaining to Google for using even my personal email. How come now they use everything about me as a Palestinian to use and try this new technology? And the checkpoints, I was detained many times at the checkpoints, and even, you know, they can detain you 3 hours at the first checkpoint and another 3 hours after 200 meters, you know, because the army, according to the Israeli military law, can detain any suspect for 3 hours at the first checkpoint and another 3 hours at the second checkpoint. And me, I am well known that I am labeled threat. I am labeled, you know, to be checked, to be detained, to be harassed at the checkpoint. So it's not about it's against people who are violent or something like that. On the other hand, how come they prevent people to visit their relatives in their own city? How come they divide the city that way? I will give you an example of Abu Aisha family who protected the Jews in 1929 in Hebron when a massacre happened in Hebron. Now their sons who were born in that house in Tel Rumeida, they are not allowed without a special permit to visit their house where they were born. On the other hand, the Israeli fanatic settlers, with their supporters, with their violent members, they attack our houses almost every day. Because we have settler violence, and we give the police, video materials for settlers attacking us. Me personally, I was attacked many times in the streets, in front of soldiers and in front of police. Any accountability? No, because the system is not about security. It's about occupation. It's about segregation, and it's about apartheid.
Thank you so much, Issa. And I want to take the moment to strengthen what Issa is saying in terms of kind of the inequality of enforcement. And if anyone is interested in learning more, reading more, I suggest looking into the reports of Yeshtin about settler violence. Yeshtin is an Israeli human rights organization. Bensi, maybe you can put a link in the chat. And Issa, I'm going to take what you're saying and head over to Gil. And Issa you talked about this concept of, it's new technology, it's an experiment, it's being used on Palestinians. And perhaps the sentence that struck me the most, both in our testimonies and in the Washington Post expose, was a testifier who said that she wouldn't feel comfortable if they used it in her mall in her hometown, and that it's a total violation of privacy of an entire people. And Issa, you were just mentioning, you worry about giving your details to Facebook and to Google, and I totally understand and empathize with that. And actually, just around the time that this article was published, Facebook actually themselves said they would be taking down their face recognition technology because it's an invasion of privacy, right? Meaning this is a conversation that's happening not only when it comes to the occupied territories, this is a conversation that's happening throughout the world. And there are multiple cities who've outlawed use of facial recognition in the world. And, Gil, it brings me to kind of this first question of when we're talking about the occupation in Palestinians and the connection to technology, what are the rights here? Because it seems as though kind of the basic rights that people have are being crossed without a due process, that so many of us in the world, we're all facing the same problem, but that in our countries with democracy, we can at least make our voices heard that this technology shouldn't be used without our permission.
Right, thank you, Becca. So we have a project called Human Rights in the Digital Age in the Association for Civil Rights in Israel, where we are trying to understand the effect of new technologies on human rights. And we definitely have a good reason to be worried because the digital age introduced too many new and alarming technologies to surveil the masses. So in the past, collecting information was much more difficult and was heavily based on human informants and poor technologies. Law enforcement agency needed to invest a lot of effort and resources to surveil suspects. And they had very limited capabilities to surveil crowds. But with new technologies, it is now much easier to surveil not only suspects, but also to surveil everybody at all times. Now, I think that 1984 dystopia is actually possible if we allow it. A few examples. Today, most of our communications are digital, and governments who wish to gather information can intercept and collect communications in bulk from the net, and computers are able to search all the content and the metadata using AI to find valuable information. Many of these surveillance regimes are secret and we don't even know about them. Governments can also store substantial amounts of communication data from our communication providers, like our cellular companies, and can analyze it in order to gather very sensitive information on the locations and contacts of millions. Every Israeli experienced this throughout 2020 when the Israeli government started using the Shin Bet, the Shabak database to track the contacts of people who had COVID and other passerbys. The invasive tool was created to fight the serious security threats, but the government used it for civil problem. And because of that, we all learned that the Shabak is collecting the communication data of everybody. So within a few hours, the Shin Bet could find locations and the contacts of people who had COVID and use the information to put people into isolation. By tracking the metadata like locations, contacts, and internet browsing history, governments can create very accurate profiles on everybody and uncover our most hidden secrets. And if this were not enough, most of us are already used to surveillance camera in our cities, which are usually just called security cameras. With time, those cameras have become much more intrusive. For a decade now, these cameras have connected to a license plate recognition system, or what we call LPR system, which tracks the locations of cars and store the data for future use. Facial recognition, or what we call FRT, and especially live FRT, is just the new child in this family, and is soon to be followed by the new rising star of the surveillance family, facial emotion recognition, a system that can recognize your emotions. So let's talk a little bit about facial recognition and its implications. So FRT surveillance system is a biometric system. It works by locating one or more faces in a moving or still image from a camera and then determining unique facial features from that image. The system then runs that image against an existing database in the pursuit of a match. The IDF Blue Wolf app matches this description. It's a facial recognition system. So FRT has two main functions. The first one is authentication, for example, to make sure that a person is indeed who he claims he is. We see this often in airports, for example. The second function, which is much more disturbing, is identification, which means that the technology can automatically identify a person from a group of people. For example, you can have a camera installed in a market that captures all the faces of the people walking there in a live feed, and then the system can automatically compare them with faces on a watch list. Once you have a match, the police can be instantly notified. So FRT has a significant implications to our basic human rights. It violates our rights to be free from surveillance, to privacy, and of course to preserve some anonymity. Without privacy, we cannot really be free, right? FRT has a significant chilling effect, and I think we heard it before from the previous speakers. It has a chilling effect on our civil liberties. For example, activists and ordinary people will think twice before going to a protest against the government, or someone may avoid attending a pride parade if they are in the closet. We change our behavior when we are being watched. And it's true everywhere, and it's most definitely true when you are under military occupation. And there is another reason to be worried. The US National Institute of Standards and Technology found that the facial recognition technology suffers from a significant bias that leads to misidentifications of minorities. So when this technology forms the basis of a police investigation, the bias is, of course, likely to lead to disproportionate incrimination and wrongful indictment among minority groups. We also saw the significant amount of errors that the Shin Bet tracking tool had when it was used to track close contacts during the COVID crisis in Israel. Those errors in the technology led to many people being isolated for 14 days of unnecessary house quarantine. Now, just imagine what would have become of a Palestinian in the occupied territories who is wrongfully identified by FRT system like Blue Wolf because of an error in the technology. He can lose his work permits, his freedom of movement, or be held in administrative detention without even knowing why. So sure, FRT can help us solve serious crimes, and sure, it can help us stop security threats, but in order to gain from the technology, we need some very, very, very strict safeguards. We need to be sure that the use of FRT is absolutely necessary and proportional and supervised by an independent body like courts The basis is of course clear, detailed, and transparent legislation. But what we see now in Hebron is the exact opposite. We at ACRI have suspected for a while now that the IDF is using FRT. Since 2018, Israel has been using FRT system to West Bank checkpoints to verify Palestinians' identity as they enter Israel. At the same time, FRT is not used at checkpoints for Israeli settlers or other Israeli commuters moving between the West Bank and Israel. So Palestinians in the West Bank who seek permits to enter Israel to work must get photographed and fingerprinted. These photographs are then stored in a biometric database and are also connected to electronic ID cards that Palestinians scan at checkpoints when they enter Israel. So as of August 2019, about 450,000 Palestinians that live in the West Bank had electronic ID cards, which means that their photos stored in the biometric database. And the software that they use in these checkpoints and these crossings by the IDF was developed by Israeli tech company called AnyVision. So AnyVision claims that its technology is not used for mass surveillance program, and it's only used for authentication of the workers as they enter Israel, as some countries have in their borders. But AnyVision's demonstration video obtained by NBC News actually showed people being tracked and recognized by their system in the street of the old city of Jerusalem and the West Bank, clearly indicating that it is used for mass surveillance. So therefore, we filed a freedom of information request for the IDF and the police and asked them to disclose any information about the use of FRT. But both bodies entirely rejected the request based on the wide exceptions of the freedom of information law here in Israel related to security. So we also filed in last September 2 freedom of information petitions to the administrative court in Jerusalem, but the court refused to intervene. So now, thanks to the report in the Washington Post, we finally understand what the army actually wanted to hide. They wanted to hide Blue Wolf. Thanks to the testimonies of Breaking the Silence and the report from the Washington Post, we learned about a mass surveillance program that started in Hebron, but will definitely not end there. It seems that the Blue Wolf software is designed to be used for mass surveillance of the entire population, and that's what we hear from the testimonies, and therefore requires a huge biometric photo bank. This will be used to deepen the surveillance and policing of the entire civilian population. We can already see from the testimonies that the technology will be used everywhere, right? Public spaces covered with cameras, maybe drones, checkpoints, and whenever you meet a soldier or a policeman. So if you are tagged in the system, every random encounter could lead to detention or questioning. So now the big question, is it legal? Right? So if we're talking about democracy, any democracy, so no, it is not legal, of course. For example, the UK Court of Appeal recently ruled that the use of automated FRT by the South Wales Police was unlawful. And the court found that the violation of privacy was not in accordance with the law. It also found that the police did not independently investigate whether the technology discriminated on racial or sex grounds and violates laws of equality. And another example here in Israel, we at the Association for Civil Rights in Israel found out that the police are using a license plate recognition system, LPR, to track cars and drivers' movement. They began using the technology a few years ago without a clear authorization in the law. Just making facts, and so we had ACRI sue the police, and the court immediately accepted our main claim or original claim that legislation is needed in order to use this kind of a surveillance tool. So in response to our petition, now the government has recently introduced what we call a surveillance law memorandum. This is a very problematic draft. If passed, that will allow the police to use LPR and FRT, but at least here there will be an open and vivid public debate about this kind of tools. And I'm sure that there will be a lot of opposition to this law. But this is all true for democracy. And we all know that the occupied territories are not a democracy. But we also have to remember that they are also not lawless, right? So in our opinion, mass surveillance on civilians under occupation is in contrast to international law, and it is not proportional. We will therefore be closely monitoring the situation with our partners in Breaking the Silence, and we'll consider taking additional legal actions. Becca, if I have a few more minutes, maybe I can, before I finish, I want to say just a few more words on another form of surveillance.
Yeah, I actually also wanted to ask you, and maybe you can include it, about the white wolf, which Issa mentioned, right? Which is seemingly a similar technology, but is in the hands of settlers, which means it's in the hand of civilians. And I'm curious kind of what your position is on, I mean, not only you said using the technology, is illegal in occupied territory, what's the situation when it's civilian versus civilian, right? Israeli civilian versus Palestinian civilian.
Of course, in a democracy, we accept that the law enforcement agency will be acting according to the law, and they cannot do anything without specific permission in the law. And by privatizing these forces to private entities is make everything much more severe, because we cannot supervise private entities like people who are guarding the settlements. So it seems like the white wolf is less intrusive than the blue wolf, because it's only as we are now understand, at least, and we have to look further in the future about the white wolf. But it seems that it's only software for authentication of identity, and it cannot be used for mass surveillance. But it's of course it's very dangerous to privatize such tools. So before I finish, maybe I just want to say a little bit about another form of surveillance, which is more targeted and yet very dangerous to human rights. And I'm talking about hacking tools like Pegasus, the spyware of Israeli NSO group. NSO Pegasus spyware is a malicious software that takes advantage of mobile phone security vulnerabilities, which allows it to gain control over someone's phone and control it entirely remotely without the individual's knowledge or consent. So to the best of our knowledge, the takeover enables searching through correspondence, emails, photos, and even remote control of components of the phone, such as its camera and the speaker, and even enables messages to be sent from the device without the knowledge of the owner of the phone. So the scope of Pegasus invasiveness makes even eavesdropping pale in comparison. So there have been many reports recently on how this technology has been used to spy on journalists, human rights defenders, and political opposition across the world. And recently on November 8, 2021, various media outlets reported on an inspection conducted on the phones of activists from human rights and civil society organizations in the occupied territories. And the inspection revealed that the Israeli company NSO Group's Pegasus spyware had been installed on these phones. And that the technological inspection of the phones was conducted by the organization Frontline Defenders, and the result of the inspection were submitted for further external testing by the University of Toronto Citizen Lab and Amnesty International Security Lab. So following this revelation, ACRI appealed to the Attorney General to request information on whether the Israeli security agencies, the Shabak or someone else is behind it. and to order the immediate cessation of the use of Pegasus program against human rights defenders. And so thank you for listening, and Becca, back to you.
Thank you, Gil. I think there's a lot of layers there of basically kind of how intrusive the technology we're talking about can enter the lives of daily people. And as you said, of course, also with the use of Pegasus specifically targeting human rights activists, which is, of course, incredibly worrying. I want to open it up to a few questions that we've gotten from the crowd. And so I'm going to start. I actually wanted to start with Issa, but I see that he's got disconnected, so we'll wait for him to come back. And in the meantime, Ori, I'm going to turn the question to you. And this is a question from Mona. And she asked, if this new technology is seen as replacing mapping missions, is it not somewhat better in terms of causing trauma, especially for children? And maybe, Ori, also when you answer the question, for those who don't know, you can just give a 2-sentence explanation of what a mapping mission is as well.
Sure. Thank you, Mona. So yeah, first, what is a mapping? A mapping is a group of soldiers, fully armed, usually, let's say, 6 to 10 soldiers, fully armed, invade a Palestinian village in the middle of the night. Invade one of the homes, a home that we checked before that is not inhabited by people who can endanger this group of soldiers. That is inhabited by innocent civilians. We invade the home. One soldier is responsible for drawing the way the house looks like. Okay, so windows, doors, whatever. Another soldier in more recent years responsible of taking photos of the people in the home. And when they finish that, they go out of the home and come back to the base. When we receive testimonies about this, this is one of the types of home invasions that we receive most testimonies about. We heard a testimony, for example, of this soldier that said how when they came home after a few weeks of mappings, they found all the drawings of these homes in their pockets. Or another soldier saying how those photos that they took during the mappings were never used. Okay, so this is mapping, and it's important to say that after a petition to the High Court about this, to the Israeli High Court about this by Physicians for Human Rights and organization Yesh Din, following a report that we also took part in about home invasions, the military declared that they will stop doing this mission of mappings. We don't know if it's true or not, but we did. I'm sure some of the people in this room saw the video published by B'Tselem only this week of soldiers invading a Palestinian home in Hebron and taking photos of this group of children. And this is after we declare that mapping is over. Okay, so this is the context of mapping. Now, to your question, Mona, look, and we are not experts in what causes more trauma to do. Okay, maybe taking photos in the streets of kids is less traumatic for them than invading their homes. It's possible, but it actually doesn't really matter, because the Blue Wolf, right, this mission that we send soldiers to take pictures of people, random people that walk by them in the street, yeah, shows the lengths, the distance that we allow ourselves to walk, the distance that the measures that we allow ourselves to take in order to control the Palestinian people. Okay, and it's a slippery slope, right? It didn't start from randomly taking pictures of people in the street. It started, we are talking 55 years of occupation. It's actually the quite normal, quite natural, I have to say, sadly, progress of everything we allow ourselves to do so far, right? So if we allow ourselves to invade innocent people's homes to take their pictures, and then we allow ourselves to invade innocent people's home to do training. Yeah, just another completely a gigantic issue that we haven't mentioned in this discussion so far. Yeah, and we allow ourselves to randomly create checkpoints in the streets inside the Palestinian cities, right? Not on the way to Israel or on the way to a settlement. When this all passes with silence, there isn't any reason that we will stop ourselves from taking pictures of people in the streets. And I think one of the most amazing parts of the Washington Post article is actually the response of the IDF spokesperson, right? What do they say there? They say, I'm paraphrasing, I don't have it in front of me, and sorry, maybe Benzi can put it in the chat. Basically, they're saying we're doing this in favor of the Palestinian people, right? It's better. And that is quite similar to a question, right? We're doing this in order to control the Palestinian population better. But what is the better for them, right? The benefit of the Palestinians themselves, right? So what do they refer to? They refer to the fact that maybe the soldier, because they have the facial recognition system in their smartphone, will have to detain the people in the street a little bit less time because they will have the information faster than they used to have when they had to call the control room, and the control room had to call the intelligence, and the intelligence will tell the soldiers on the ground what to do. But it's very dangerous for us to look at this in a positive way, because when we talk about invasions to privacy, and yeah, I don't want to repeat everything that Gil mentioned so eloquently. When we talk about all of that, right? We cannot say this is better for the Palestinians because maybe it is less traumatizing for the children, because it doesn't replace anything. It's another level of invasion to privacy. We didn't stop doing anything else before we went on to do this. Okay. So I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a really good point that, when we're looking at the use of this technology, right, it's another aspect of making our presence felt, meaning it's another way to uphold the occupation. You can't necessarily, you necessarily cannot do the occupation better. You can't do it more morally. There is no technological solution to control Palestinians or to control another people in a way that is morally okay, or that falls into the lines of democracy. And Issa, in that sense, I think that perhaps Linda asking this question, I'm not sure if it was rhetorical, but I think it's actually, I'm curious to hear, Issa, from your perspective of, how do those in power think this is helping a peaceful future and not just making more traumatized and angry Palestinians? Now, Issa, of course, you can't answer that in terms of how do those in power think, but I do think it's a relevant question of, what is the feeling in Hebron today in terms of the increased surveillance, the increased, lack of freedom of movement on a very basic level. We're not talking about even freedom of movement from going to one city to another or going from the West Bank to Jordan, but rather often going from outside of your house. In the Washington Post article, one of the residents of Hebron said that he is letting his kids play outside less because of the surveillance. And so, Issa, I'm wondering kind of what your take on this is in kind of the day-to-day feeling of Palestinians who are living in Hebron, especially those living close to the settlements where we know surveillance is likely to be higher. Issa, are you with us?
Okay, unmute. Okay, something very important, that the occupation in West Bank is occupying Palestinian territories not to make our life easier. And the answer of the spokesperson of the army about that this is better. No, I'm an electrical engineer. I'm aware of technology. This kind of technology didn't make my life easier. Didn't make the life of the Palestinians who are living in Hebron easier. It's in addition to everything else. So they didn't stop, you know, the 22 checkpoints, the closed streets, the closed markets, the closed shops, the closed houses, the house invasion, the settler violence. No, this kind of technology is in addition of everything else they have until now. So they add another layer of harassment and making the life harder and harder. And I think the main purpose is to force us leave our own homes. Because in one corner, you have 20 cameras inside Tel Rumin. In spite that you have soldiers, you have, you know, you are observed from all directions. So Palestinians in the city feel more watched inside their homes. They are not worried about, you know, about that if they do something wrong against the army or against the settlers, because the military law doesn't allow them even to defend themselves from the Israeli settler violence. And the main violence in H2 or in Area C now is the settler violence. So if they really care about the Palestinians and they want to make the Palestinians' life easier, they should talk about ending the occupation, ending the apartheid, and, you know, asking us what we want. You know, they do something, you know, in a kind of supremacy, not in a kind of, you know, making something, you know, better for the Palestinians. And something else very important, Pekka, we don't want a nicer occupation. We want an end for the Israeli occupation and accountability for the occupiers for what they are doing for us.
Thank you, Issa. Yeah, I think that's a good point. Meaning, I think this technology is something that as time goes on, we're all going to have to deal with it no matter what. But if being a Palestinian in Hebron and under occupation means dealing with it without having the right or access to a government that you're a part of, that with someone who represents you. Actually, I think that's you know, brings to a question that now I'm looking who wrote it, but someone in the beginning wrote, you know, also Tel Aviv, when you come into Tel Aviv from the north on the Ayalon, it says that there are cameras, you know, all over Tel Aviv, which of course is true. If you're walking throughout the city, you see that the city is full of cameras. And Gil, I'm wondering if you could kind of clarify here, what is the difference in terms of what's going on with, you know, the Hebron smart city and Blue Wolf and the cameras that we're seeing around Tel Aviv?
Okay, so we have the CCTVs and cameras, and they can maybe see what's happening in public spaces, and usually even without hearing what's going on, just seeing the area, and then somebody who is looking at the monitor can see if something wrong is happening in this specific area. And I don't think that these cameras are actually helping to improve security. They mainly help to improve the sense of security. And that's why they are sometimes a little bit popular among people. But the new technologies are not anything like it, because they are connected to these mass surveillance tools like LPR, like FRT, facial recognition technology. It's not just looking at what's going on to see if there is something dangerous or risky happening in the square or something. It's identifying anybody that walks in this market or this street, or any car that moves in this area, and to see that Ori and Issa are now talking for 15 minutes. And so this is much more intrusive. This is information that is just scary to think that somebody can get access to without us being even able to know about it or understand it. So the amount of the, I mean, it's much more intrusive and much more dangerous than just irregular cameras. But as we also saw in the Washington Post article, those regular CCTVs and regular cameras are also getting much more problematic, because now they are much better technologically. They can watch a bigger area, and they can also have some software that can automatically recognize that something is irregular or that something happening. And we also saw that those cameras are sometimes see what's happening in private homes. So this is also causing people to feel like they are being watched at their own homes and not just in the street. And that's some of the evidence that we hear from Hebron, that these cameras, so many cameras, even if they are just regular cameras, they can see what's going on inside your living room, and that's seriously affect your ability to live a normal life.
If I may just add something, maybe two points about this. First, as a citizen, and maybe second, as a soldier. I think one of the most important things to remember when talking about different cameras in Tel Aviv is that we, the people who live in Tel Aviv or inside the Green Line, we are citizens. We have the right to vote to this government and to the municipality and to the different powers that decided to put these cameras that vigilate us, okay? Even if they have facial recognition, okay? Even if they do have that, doesn't matter for this point. The systems that we heard about in our testimonies, and the systems that are used to control the Palestinian population, are also decided by us, by the government that we vote for, but not by, but Issa in Hebron, for example, doesn't have the right to affect those systems that control them and the powers that use this technology in order to control the Palestinians. The second point is that the cameras in Tel Aviv, right? We are not seeing a foreign military walking in the streets of Tel Aviv and taking pictures of people in the street in order to add them to a biometric database, right? This is not what we're seeing. We're seeing a system, maybe the municipality operates it or whatever company. I am also not a fan of that, right? But it's a completely different story than a foreign army walking in the streets and taking people's photos when 4 soldiers are fully armed while they take these pictures. Right, so I think it's a very, very important distinction that we have to remember to make.
Absolutely. I think we're going to now go into kind of closing thoughts and closing statements. And so I'm going to give each of you an opportunity to share your last thoughts on this issue with us for tonight. Gil, I'm going to start with you, and perhaps you see in the chat actually that there was a question that I think is right up your alley as to if there's evidence that this technology is used to create a file on or intimidate journalists and activists. And maybe you can kind of wind that into, what you would like to leave the audience with tonight.
The simple answer is yes. I mean, we saw how some regimes across the world are trying to intimidate journalists and activists using different kind of surveillance tools. And it's actually quite simple today to even find resources of journalists. You can use cellular tracking, or you can use FRT or other systems. So we have in democracy, usually we have a specific safeguards for journalists and human rights defenders that make it much difficult and with much more safeguards and restrictions to the government to follow journalists. And of course, in the occupied territories, it's a huge problem, and we also are afraid that these surveillance tools can be used to just get sensitive information on just innocent people, and then maybe try to convince them to cooperate, just because they will be afraid that the information that the Shabak have on them will be used against them. So this is another things to be worried about. So just to conclude, I just want to say how important the testimonies that Breaking the Silence is collecting to reveal this kind of new things that's going on the ground, and how much this is important to make everybody come together and fight it. So thank you very much for hosting this important debate and for your work.
Thank you so much for being with us and enriching us with your knowledge. Issa, would you be able to share with the audience some parting thoughts from Hebron? What is your, what is your kind of, as we go into tomorrow and we know that this technology exists, we know it's being used on, regular civilians just like yourself in the West Bank, in Hebron, what is it important for you to pass on as a human rights defender to the people who are listening in tonight?
First, I want to thank you, and I want to invite everybody today to come and visit Hebron and join the tours. It's very important to come and see by your eyes the cameras, the systems, the closed streets, the closed markets, the occupation and apartheid, the segregation. So this is something very important for us. The surveillance and the blue wolf and this new technology is a new advanced techniques from the occupation to make our life harder and harder, to force us leave our homes. The occupation in the West Bank is not for security. It's about to protect the settlements and to protect the theft of the Palestinian land. But I promise everybody that this kind of technology will not stop us from calling for freedom and justice and equality, and continue our struggle against the Israeli occupation and the Israeli apartheid. And this kind of, let me say, educational webinar or Zoom is part of our struggle. And I want everybody to start thinking how to make the occupation costly, because without making the occupation costly, nothing will change.
Thank you, Issa. Absolutely, totally agree. And Ori, we'll end with you tonight. It's thanks to these testifiers who, moments getting out of the army, it seems, came and decided to share what they saw because they were so worried by it. And you yourself, as someone who's come in and given testimony to Breaking the Silence, and all of us who represent the 1,300 testifiers, what do you think is important at this moment? The occupation continues, this technology is out there. What's important for you, for our viewers to walk away with?
Yeah, I think first of all, this whole story that we were happy that we can be a part of reminded me, and I hope it can remind everybody, that sometimes we have to go back to the basics, right? Because it's very easy to be carried away by the daily news, by the interesting things that are the breaking news that everyone are interested in, which are also important. I'm not saying they're not important, but it's also critical to go back to the basic and just listen to what the people who actually are doing the occupation every single day, what do the soldiers, right? What do these people have to tell us? And unfortunately, in the extremely not transparent system of the occupation, we have to remember to listen to these voices. And this is something that this article was very bolded for me, even from within Breaking the Silence. So I think it's extremely important to remember it also outside of Breaking the Silence. The second point that I would like to say is that we have to remember, to see this as another level, another step of the system of our control, another signal of what happens when we allow our country, Israel, to continue on this trajectory of control, trajectory of apartheid, trajectory of looking at Palestinians as not as human beings, not as equal to us. And it connects to my last point that if we will not start doing something, we will, in 1 year, we'll have to publish a new set of testimonies about something worse. And in 2 years, worse. And in 3 years, worse. And this is why we're here in this seminar, in this discussion. We're not here to educate people who are interested. Maybe it's like a side effect of this discussion. We are here because we need people to act. And if this this 1 hour and a half would encourage the people that were present or their friends or their families to act, this is the most important thing we can achieve from this conversation. And thank you for listening. And Issa and Gil, it was a pleasure to also participate with you. Yeah.
Thank you, Ori.
Thank you.
Thank you all, Gil, Ori, Issa. Thank you all for participating, for sharing your knowledge, for sharing your experience. I would like to strengthen what all three of you said as we finish the panel tonight. And you know, it was said multiple times. Issa, you said it well. You know, we're not looking for an enlightened occupation. We're not looking to run the occupation better. There is no way to do it morally. And I think for, you know, the 124 people who are currently in this chat room, it's important to remember, you know, when I joined Breaking the Silence, it was with an understanding that I'm only fighting for the rights, that if those rights were being taken away from me, I wouldn't allow it. And I think that stands for everyone here. What we're talking about today in terms of use of technology in immoral ways, it's something that in the modern era, we are all going to have to deal with. But if it's something that speaks to us as individuals, that we wouldn't want cameras on our streets that could recognize our faces, that could lead to arrests of innocent people, that could come into our houses, then we should be doing the same. We should be standing with those who are currently having this technology being used against them. And so thank you very much for joining. I want to give a special thanks to the testifiers who came to Breaking the Silence in the past year and a half and shared their experiences and allowed us to be able to talk about this in a much wider way than we've been able to before. And I encourage everyone to come to Hebron, see for yourself, as Issa said, and please do support our work at Breaking the Silence so we can continue to work with you to fight the occupation and bring about its end. Thank you, everyone, and have a great evening.